when the paintings are behaving badly, other than turning them around, what
Mhm.
else do you do with them?
Other than punishing them?
Yeah, well, no, but that's only one form of punishing them. I can think of lots of ways to punish them.
True. There are times when I make sister paintings, and I find that that can really mitigate potential frustration. So I'll make two similar paintings if I have like an idea for a painting, and then as I'm creating this work, like, oh, well, what about if it was actually this instead, a slight difference? Instead of wiping off what I've done or painting it over, I'll just start another painting of that alternative idea, and then those will be shown as sister paintings. So then it's sort of like one single image doesn't have to carry all of the ideas.
Welcome to This Is Not Advice, where we hear from successful people in different occupations about how they do every aspect of their jobs. I'm Roy Bahat. I'm an MBA professor and a startup investor in the future of work at the venture capital firm Bloomberg Beta. Today, we're going to talk with painter and visual arts professor at Columbia and Pratt, Kelsey Shwetz. Kelsey also happens to be my drawing teacher. And though her own work is in oil paints, she's anything but traditional. One of my favorite pieces of hers manages to reference both The Legend of Zelda and stained glass windows in Prague. And of course, we'll talk about every aspect of how to be an artist, from how and why one becomes an artist, what is the art world, how an artist progresses in their career, how they work with galleries, the role of Instagram and art fairs, how to manage self-doubt and the emotional vulnerability of creating art, and why it might serve an artist to be a hunter instead of a fawn. Welcome, and remember, this is not advice. So we are here to talk about how to be an artist. Kelsey, in addition to being an accomplished painter in her own right, also teaches, which is part of how we got to know each other. And so we're going to talk about things like, how do you decide to become an artist and actually become an artist? Like, sort of, it's not one of these occupations like doctor, where there is an official certification of like, thou art hereby an artist. And so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about when you make work, how you get ideas and how you actually make the work, and, you know, how you then sell the work and get it out into the world and sort of communicate about yourself. And then we'll talk a little bit about managing a career and about broadening out beyond the individual to like the art ecosystem, world, system. Actually, is there some word in the art world that people use to describe sort of like, you don't call it an industry, do you?
It is indeed the art world.
Okay, the art world. Perfect.
Yeah.
No, that's perfect. I want to use the language. And by the way, anytime that I use language, you're like, yeah, that's not how we say it in the art world. I really want to invite you to correct me, because part of, I think, how we all learn what it's like to work in another domain is by adopting the language of that domain, because the language includes a lot of what's there. So, okay. So maybe we'll just start with this, which is telling your story of like, okay, you are a young person.
Yes.
You at some point say to yourself, I am going to become an artist. And just sort of how, like, what were some of those early moments? Just tell us the story of how this came to be.
Right. So as a young kid, as I'm sure most young kids do, I was always doing something creative. I had a little pottery wheel. I would do fiber stuff. I would always draw. I would always paint. This continued. I took an art class throughout all of high school. I have one distinct memory. I had this wonderful art teacher, and we had this sort of weeks-long assignment. We were tasked to create this vessel. It had to hold water. It had to be picked up by a handle. It had to conform to specifications. We had to paint it, the surface on the outside. This took weeks. Everyone was incredibly invested. And when we were finished, we were on the first floor. He made us line up one by one and drop our vessels out the window.
Okay.
They would smash on the ground.
It's sort of like that egg engineering thing that kids do in school, where it's like, make a thing designed to cradle this egg, except you thought you had made something precious and lasting and important, and you became emotionally invested in that thing and all that.
And then we had to reconstruct some kind of object based on the shards that we picked up from the concrete. And I think that was one of the first moments.
A Winnipeg public education going a long way, huh?
Yeah. When I realized art can be something else. It's not necessarily just this private practice of drawing or cataloging your thoughts. It can surprise yourself. So then I went to undergrad in Canada for clinical psychology, which is what I thought I was going to do. All of my art practice there was through electives, and I should have paid more attention to the signs. Every elective class I could take was art related.
Your body was telling you where you wanted to go.
All of my friends were from those classes, and when my peers were volunteering in clinics, I was volunteering at the art museum. So had I processed that maybe more carefully, I would have come to this decision much earlier.
Well, I love knowing that. How did you go from, wait a minute, left to its own devices,
Right.
I go towards something creative, to, I'm curious both how you got to it, but also some of the inner experience. Like, what did you like about it? Or what didn't you like about it? Just sort of what were you feeling?
So I had labored under the impression that if I was going to do art, it would be sort of on the side. It always had been on the side. I moved to Montreal with my partner at the time, and I rented like this cheap studio it was a recording studio. The person who ran it gave me this like little spot just in the middle of this big room. And the bass from the music would be so loud that my canvas would vibrate. And I had to take all of my stuff down.
So at this point, you're just making things for the sake of making them in this borrowed space. Love.
Absolutely.
Okay. And with the shaking canvas, that's kind of like an amazing image.
Yeah. And my intention was to start my MA PhD there in Montreal. That was why I moved there. And then I kind of went through this crisis, and I felt like because I met all of these new people and they didn't know me as this person who was in this field.
Here comes identity, basically.
Yes, exactly. All I talked about was art, and they knew that I had a studio, and that's when
you must be an artist.
The crisis kind of started. And I remember, I think this is always the case when we want to make a big life change. We first admit it to ourselves, and then we talk to maybe our friends about it, and then we'll blab about it to anyone who will listen. And I remember at a party, I was talking to someone I had just met, and kind of like, I don't know what to do. It's such a tricky path being an artist. And he said, oh, well, just let art be your jam, and psychology can be your bread and butter. And I thought I just wanted to eat jam.
Oh, so jam, not in the sense of like your jam.
No, like the
literally
jam.
The thing you put on, the sweet thing that you add to the bread and butter, which are the nourishment
thing. You could take or leave, but your bread and butter is going to be psychology. And I rejected it so much, and I decided I would just go for it. I had split up with my partner, and I had to sublet an apartment from a friend of a friend who was an artist. He was a painter. And all over the walls of his apartment were his paintings. And I think in that moment, I realized this is someone else, a concrete person who's doing it. I can do it. That was the turning point.
I love it. Okay. And then what did you do? How did you decide?
I started telling everyone I was a painter. I moved to New York. I got a studio. I did my grad school here. That's it.
Okay. So I want to now generalize, because you, in addition to being an artist, I said you're a teacher, and not just, sort of students like out there, but you're a professor at both Columbia and Pratt. And so you've now seen many people enter art successfully, enter art unsuccessfully, try to decide whether to be artists as an occupation or not. And I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about your reflections of what are the patterns? What makes people succeed in coming in and not, and ...
Well, a lot of the questions I get from students are, after I graduate, what do I do? How do I set up a studio? How do I find a studio? How do I begin practicing seriously? And I think a key to success in art, which can be very individual. It can mean many different things to many different people. I think you find success when you want to go to the studio and you surprise yourself in the studio and you are committed to this practice. And it certainly is like this sometimes. It's very rarely this total ascent. Becoming comfortable with the highs and the lows in your practice and the times when you feel like you've forgotten how to make work or have ideas, weathering those periods, I think, is really crucial.
That makes complete and total sense. And so there's sort of the doubt periods. And this happens in my line of work too. You have people considering starting a company. Sometimes the doubt is trying to tell you something. Like sometimes you shouldn't keep going, right? Because the people who are like, I should just keep going through the doubt are sometimes the people who are doing dopey stuff that will never go anywhere. Now, of course, sometimes you think it'll never go anywhere and then all of a sudden it takes off. I'm sure that happens in the art world all the time. So when people are asking themselves, okay, but really? Because the answer can't possibly be to always keep going no matter what. And so I'm curious when there are moments where somebody decided not to pursue it or felt doubt and it was definitely worth ignoring the doubt and overcoming it, like what's some of the texture of those moments for people?
I think there are more than one reason why someone who wants to be an artist might stop. One, I think, is that if you have to take a job to support yourself, that overtakes your time and you don't have energy for the studio and you feel like you aren't spending enough time there and it doesn't feel exciting to you anymore. It could also be you have very honestly tried for many years and perhaps there hasn't been a lot of outside reinforcement. I think a lot of people also can just change their minds. Some artists go on to run gallery spaces or arts organizations, or they end up in arts admin, or they completely change paths organically. If you're feeling self-doubt as an artist, the world will give you enough of that. Don't yourself. Try not to.
Right. And look, we'll talk about the inner life of managing your career as an artist as we talk about sort of progressing your career. But okay, so then people decide they want to do it. And then unlike other occupations where there's a clear path, you want to be a lawyer, you have to go to law school. It feels like there are so many more choices available in how to go about the creative occupations of all kinds. And so what are the choices people make? Is it about school versus just making things? Do you kind of have to go to art school? How do you think about cementing your intention to become an artist and turning it into action earlier?
I think a lot of artists go the route of art school, so BA, MFA. That was not my path, exactly. Did not do a BFA. But there are very recently, for those who question that institutional model, it's expensive, doesn't necessarily guarantee any sort of success in the art world. I think it's valuable because you're in this pressure cooker and you're surrounded by other people who are more brilliant than you are and who can help you. And you never have another chance in your life where people are paying that much attention to every thought you're having and every move you make with your work. But there are things like residencies. There are programs like Skowhegan where it's prolonged, kind of like summer intensive, months long. There are all kinds of alternative art models where you do find yourself in a critique-based setting. A critique is where you present your work and you're given feedback.
Somebody tells you what they think.
Yeah. There are a lot of artists who are completely self-taught, and there are resources online, there are resources in perhaps the city they live in, and they totally eschew the institutional model as well.
Given that some of becoming a working artist is having people buy your work, how does the choice about schooling play into, just back to the art world, how accepted you are?
There are many artists that sell their work from their studio or use Instagram as a platform. My grad school had these kinds of like end of year shows or summer shows or our thesis show. And that was an opportunity where a lot of gallerists, collectors, art advisors would come because it was a place where they were invited. And
Right, it creates like a concentrated node where they
wouldn't necessarily, as an individual, have that sort of reach to be able to just send a cold email and have that person respond as just an individual.
Right, it kind of creates legitimacy.
Yes, yeah.
And okay, so now like I'm just in the headspace of you're learning either while in school or afterward. You're building skills clearly while learning. You're building relationships and an understanding. You're also making art. And so at what point do you start thinking of yourself as like, I am making real art that, or maybe that's been happening all along? Or is that not even a question? Like I kind of imagine, like, look, there's a bunch of people who just do something not professionally at home for fun.
Sure,
and again, this is a unique occupation, not unique, but rare in the sense that the line between being a successful professional and like, there is no at-home actuary,
yes.
Like an amateur actuary. But there is that for painters.
Sure.
George W. Bush is apparently out there painting all the time, but
a gift to the world.
Yeah. And so I guess I'm just trying to follow what are those moments of steps forward in the work itself. And maybe it comes from getting the ideas, but I'm just trying to get to that moment of creation where like, okay, now I'm making something for real.
Yeah, for me that happened in Montreal the first time I had an exhibition. So it was the first time that people that weren't myself or my friends saw, engaged with, and interacted with my work.
It was about, in that case, audience is what it was. Is that the right word or not the right word?
Yeah, bearing witness to this work.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me. And did that change how you thought about subsequent work you wanted to make?
Well, the part that was interesting was that I feel this still, when you're very close to someone and you're looking at their work, you can't help but infuse your interpretation of the work with the person. So I think when I saw people that had no idea who I was just engaging with the work, it kind of clicked that the work really has to stand on its own. I'm not always going to be able to be next to it and explaining it or talking about relevant points in it.
You're sitting now among some of your works.
Yeah.
Where does an individual, not like to pick a work that you want to, you don't have to pick one specifically, you can. Where does it start? Does it start with an idea?
Yeah, oftentimes, I think for me, there's two threads. So for some paintings, it starts with an idea of kind of an imagined space.
Okay.
Or an amalgamation of different spaces. And I'll start with like an incredibly rough sketch. I probably have like very, very loose.
Well, but even before your hand touches the page, you say that's loose as a sketch, but there is some idea. And so like, what is that process like in your mind? From my knowledge of your work, and I don't know if this has been true throughout your career, it's an imagined scene where the viewer is outdoors. It maybe also can be indoors, but there's like, it combines elements of nature. And so it's, there's sort of a scene, if you will. And I'm not sure if maybe it seems less abstract. Like I could describe what I'm looking at without saying
yes.
a bunch of red and brown stuff. I could say it looks like flowers in the woods or whatever it is. And so where actually does that, like the first glimmer of this is a new work, what is that experience like inside of you?
So I'll do a lot of writing in my sketchbook. Other times it'll be observational snippets that I like to sort of keep a mental catalog of. So if I see a certain quality of light, I'll sort of file that away. Or if I'm thinking of how could I describe this idea visually, I'll sort of jot that down. And those sort of like this archive that I have of like, oh, I remember seeing this reflection happening here. And I remember seeing this, I could put those two together and that might begin to sort of indicate this idea that I have. And the ideas can be as broad as escapism.
I have a sentiment that I want to bring to life.
Yes.
But before we get to escapism, I know I'm drilling in here, but I really want to make sure I follow. Is that like you're reading a book, you are thinking about life, you're walking down the street, you wake up and every day have 1,000 ideas and you discard 999 of them?
Every day.
But what leads up to the word escapism?
For me, it's a lot of what I'm feeling in my life. And that has only become clear after the body of work is finished. So I've had friends say, oh, well, this work is sort of like all about this. And you were kind of dealing with this at this time. And it wasn't a very conscious, I didn't make that conscious connection. But it's very much things that I'm, thinking about, struggling with, excited about in my own life.
You might have some theme that you're grappling with in a relationship with a human being, in what you see in the world, ... Okay, and then you've got some theme, and it could be something other than a theme. You are creating something completely original, almost like a novelist, born out of your own mind, obviously your own experiences also. But so what does that process feel like of translating a sentiment or an idea or words on the page? Are the words on the page things like, I don't know, it looks like some kind of an arcade with archways behind you? Is it more literal description or something else? I'm just curious, what does it look like and feel like?
Well, so then I'll sort of begin the search in the observable world for some of these things that I think could represent what I'd like to talk about. So I'll often set up photo shoots.
Oh, interesting.
And I've ordered, my Etsy history must be absurd. I've ordered glass fruit. I've ordered, candles that look like baguettes. I've ordered, there's tons of objects that I'll collect or I'll set up. And then I try to find spaces that exist in the real world
that need.
Yeah.
Or that imagination. Okay, so keep going. So you set up a photo shoot.
Yeah, or I'll find a space that seems to really sort of like fit what I'm thinking about. And I'll take reference photos and use those photos to sort of recombine the spaces and create a composition from there.
Just for those who may not know what that means when making a work of art, what constitutes a composition? Composition
is basically, how are the shapes arranged on your canvas?
I see. So you can sort of imagine the broad brush strokes.
Yeah.
What are the choices you find yourself making at that point while you're sort of developing the idea?
I never want to make complete fantasy paintings.
Your things are sort of somewhere in the kind of the line between what's actually in the world and what's imagined.
Yes,
like one of
exactly.
The things I've noticed is a lot of play in that line for you.
Exactly. I think about what are ways that I can maybe manipulate a space that feels very familiar so that it becomes a bit unsettling or strange. In this painting here, this was set up in my friend's apartment. They live in Brooklyn, but there's a stained glass window and a reflection of light coming through the stained glass window, which is from a church that I saw in Prague years ago, but I had always sort of remembered it. And then I created like a computer screen with like a Zelda video game.
Amazing. I know where that comes from.
Yes.
And then you kind of superimpose that onto the image.
So I'm putting, 3 very separate elements that weren't actually existing together into a semi-believable space.
I love that. And so is that still a solitary thing at that point? Or which parts bring others into the process?
Others come into the process once the painting has started. There was a period, I think, in grad school where just because you're talking with everybody so much, you end up talking about the ideas you have for a painting. And I feel like for me, that can kind of let the air out of the tires a bit. Like it sort of deflates the desire to make it into something that can be seen by someone else if you've already described it. So I like to sort of save that part, keeping it private. And then once the painting begins, then I'll have people in my studio and they're welcome to
come in and join you in it. How would you characterize what's the same, like you're now a working artist who has been doing things for a long time. I don't know how much your style has evolved over time, but it seems like you tend to work in a very consistent set of mediums. Do we say mediums or media?
Yeah. Media.
And a legible cluster of themes. And so I'm curious, sort of, where do the edges feel like for you? What are you choosing versus what you're like, yeah, I'm not going to think about whether this is going to be a sculpture because I'm not a sculptor. You know, like what's inbounds and out of bounds in terms of what you find yourself thinking about, or where do you ask yourself questions? What are you trying to figure out? You know, all that.
Sure. I mean, many artists are multidisciplinary. I am not one of those artists. I only do oil paintings and drawings. In terms of subject matter, that does evolve and change. There have been through lines for years of my work. So I've always been interested in light, any sort of aperture, like windows, stained glass.
Okay, can I just ask, when you say you're interested in light, you're a painter.
Yeah.
How could a painter not be interested in light? It seems like it. Like, what do you mean by that? Or do you mean painting the way light lands in the real? Like, yes. what do you mean when you say light?
Yeah, exactly. Instances where light feels like the protagonist. You know, if you think of sort of like a mid-noon day, you're taking light a bit for granted. You see shadows on the ground, but light doesn't in and of itself feel like it's doing something specifically. But I think a lot about cast light, the way light can fall from a window and illuminate something. I think a lot about liminal times of day. So dusk, the magic hour, that shows up a lot in my paintings. So when light really feels like a central visual concern.
So where the way the light plays in the image is part of what the experience is of the image. Are there other artists who you see as your close cousins? Or if somebody wanted to understand your evolution as an artist, who you have to understand X to understand me. I mean, maybe it's nothing like that, but I'm curious how you see yourself as related to the work of other artists, past or present.
Yeah, so this is a very long skip between when we are both practicing, but there's this painter, was a Netherlandish painter in the late 1400s, Patnier. And how could you not become a painter if your last name is Patnier?
You're right. Yeah, guaranteed.
But he made these paintings, and they're religious allegories, of course. At the time, this is what painters did. He has these incredible works, and I'm thinking there's this one painting, landscape with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's this like red on fire sky and these anthropomorphic sort of rock faces and mountains. And then just in like the very bottom right corner, there's like little figures, you know, the angels and the figures, which make it a religious allegory. When I first sort of was introduced to his work, I felt that the landscape or the objects itself were alive and they were the protagonists. And their presence was so much more powerful than the figure.
Whoever the figures were. And so you were inspired by the fact that you wanted to draw out the element of it where the landscapes were as alive as elements of the work as the characters, if you will.
Yes, or certainly that they have this kind of presence without a figure picture necessarily.
And you learned about this artist when?
In grad school.
Are there others who are worth noting that are particularly significant to you?
Well, I've been such a fan of Shara Hughes. She's a contemporary young artist for so many years. Our works are very different, but she has this kind of like looseness and command of color and vivacity to the brushstrokes that I've always admired.
One thing you didn't mention is whether somebody would want this piece of art that you are working on. In what ways, if ever, as you are beginning to work on a piece of art, do you think about either the audience or, again, you can correct my language, or the market for it?
There are certainly market trends in art, and those shift. Years ago, it was zombie formalism. And
what was zombie formalism?
It's sort of like abstract work that is sort of like precise and very concerned with just like the technical sort of application of paint. And certainly one could think about, okay, I see these kinds of works are selling. This is the kind of work that it seems to desire.
Like, just so we know, what's a live trend that's relevant to your work right now in the art world?
Well, I think there's been hints of like surrealism becoming talked about. Again, there's the discovery of many women surrealist artists, rediscovery of them. Landscape, in a sense, and still life, I believe, have a bit of a resurgence as well. Something I like to think about is your art practice having two parts, and one is what happens in the walls of your studio and what happens outside of your studio. And I personally think it's very dangerous to let that become that permeable.
You want there to be as strict separation as possible.
I think,
and by the way, I can see why that is. I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure there are people who, I mean, look, Andy Warhol seemed to treat it differently, right?
Yeah,
just like trying to make commercial shit constantly.
Yeah.
And many ways up the mountain, I imagine there are some artists who are like hermits and never come to 26th Street or whatever the galleries are in New York. I don't even know where they are anymore to show their work.
Sure.
And so I'm curious both about the rationale and your, in general, but also your particular experience of it.
For me, I don't consider the market or the gallery or the collector base when I'm making paintings. I think that if I want to be a painter for, 50, 60, 70 years, there's going to have to be some sort of internal drive that makes me want to go to the studio, whether or not my paintings are selling or not. And if that drive gets too entwined with market success, I worry about the longevity of a practice.
Because market success is fickle.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I'm sure there are many probably stories of artists who worked in a particular way for a long time without much success, and then all of a sudden,
Sure.
And the art is never with a buyer in advance, correct, for you? Like, I know people do commissioned pieces sometimes. That's not your way of working.
No, it'll be at a gallery at an exhibition. There are cases where the gallerist will send a PDF of the works to collectors before the exhibition opens, and maybe they're...
Oh, but that's different because the work is already made. So I guess I'm asking whether there's ever a case where a collector says, I'd really love something just like that thing you did, but my house, or something like that. And it sounds like that doesn't even come to mind.
I don't do commissions, no, but many artists do. Yeah.
Okay. And then what else is relevant to know about the kind of ideation, the initial creation, the intention of the work of art? You've had bad ideas that you're like, now I no longer ever do it that way,
I think I'm still discovering what that is. I think there are instances where I'll make some paintings and I feel like these are perfect paintings. And I'll make paintings that like, I'm not so sure. And maybe those paintings that I wasn't so sure about, those will sell right off the first things at an exhibition. And the ones that I really feel, I really figured something out here, I did something very interesting, might not sell at all or sell much later.
Right, meaning the other reason why it's tough to game the market is that in addition to the market being fickle, your read of what the market wants and what the market in fact wants.
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and it's really so individual. Like, it's a single person buying a piece, and maybe one will resonate with someone and another person not at all.
I like that. Do you hear from other artists who are stuck?
Oh,
like, I don't know what to make anymore. Here I am. I've done all this work to get here.
Yes.
It
happens constantly. It happens to me. It happens to my friends. We talk about it. It feels like you don't have any ideas anymore. I've heard it put like it's sort of a well, like your artistic inspiration is a well. And after a while, the well runs dry, but you can't just expect to only be in your studio producing and painting and have an endless source of inspiration. So that's when you have to get out into the world, see other art, go and do things, do other mediums, to kind of fill the well back up. And it usually happens and you have ideas again and you're inspired in the studio, but each time you have that dry period, it's like heartbreak. It's like you feel like, oh, I know other people have been heartbroken, but I'm the only one.
Right, of course. I mean, this is the sort of self-compassion thing. You hit those moments and you're like, I'm the worst. But in fact, everybody is there. And so it's sort of just a thing to work through. I mean, are there cases where people, I don't know, get the yips more permanently?
I'm sure there are. I feel like it's almost like your memory becomes erased. The last time it happened, you feel like, oh, but this time I really am.
Right. I mean, it's sort of like
really not going to be able to get out of it.
You're like, I had kids and I vaguely remember it was hard, but it wasn't that hard. And I was like, this is hard.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. That all makes sense. Anything else you want to talk about on ideas?
I think it's incredible how within artists, idea generation can look so different. That's something that's always really fascinated me. I think we've done a great job talking about it.
Okay. And so now let's talk about making it. So you've begun to sketch.
Yes.
You've begun to do some concepts. Walk us through kind of from there to finished work. How do you think about the major steps? How many are you working on at once? How did you pick your media? Like whatever. We can talk about all this stuff.
Yeah.
But you start wherever, and I will, as we explore this making the work section, I will ask questions to fill in the blanks.
Yeah. So the work will start with either a sketch or an idea. And then I like to hunt for observational references. So things that already exist in the world, or I'll create these scenes or these settings.
So sometimes you will like bring the TV with the Zelda game to your friend's place and stage it there in order to prepare to make the work.
Yeah. Or sometimes that sort of juxtaposition just happens on the canvas. I don't have to necessarily, part everything around. I will do something called underpainting, which is basically getting in the very basic shapes and the contours of what will be happening in the painting. From there, the details come through. I used to struggle so much with which colors to use, those decisions. And I would spend hours mixing colors and I would be painting and it wouldn't work. So I would wipe it off. You wipe off 4 hours of work. It was really demoralizing. Then I discovered the study, which is just this such an obvious solution. Study, you're making just kind of like a small, quick little painting with the general shapes, but you're figuring out your color there. And now I feel like I've maybe internalized enough of those lessons that I feel like I rarely struggle with color so much anymore. But that was a part of my process for a very, very long time, that struggle.
I was trying to figure out what the color scheme would be about something.
Like why should this part be kind of reddish orange? Why not purple? Maybe green is better. Let me try that. And I stubbornly refuse to use Photoshop for this. I think it would be such an easy fix. That's never been part of my practice.
We talked about this a little earlier, but I'm just curious, how do you think about that line of digital media and where digital, kind of plays in your desire to do something? It might just be simple for you. I just don't want to do it, period, end of story, full stop.
Yeah. I think it kind of ticks back to what I said about talking too much to people about the idea of the work. I had a studio assistant who was fantastic with Photoshop. She could make like a color mock-up of what the painting would look like, But in that sense, then that felt like the first time I was seeing that image in the world. And it kind of
It's
it
like stole
me
something from you almost.
yeah, like it kind of made me feel less inclined to actually bother to paint it at that point. There's something that for me feels very significant when, your canvas can just be like splotches of general shapes and a bit of detail, but there's always a moment when it sort of clicks into focus. And it's like, that's what this thing looks like. I made this thing. And it's that moment that feels very significant for me. And it sort of feels a bit diminished if I see that in a digital mock-up beforehand.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. And by the way, how did you come to focus on paints in the first place? Like, is it everything you ever tried?
No, I've tried.
Imagine not. I imagine part of a formal art education is making sure, are you sure you don't want to make art with a kazoo or whatever other exotic media may be available?
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly not musical. I did a bit of ceramics, but for some reason, painting was just the medium that I felt most comfortable with, that I felt was really, really natural. And that same high school art teacher, we weren't allowed to have oil paints. Like it was just like a safety regulation, but he would sneak in his own oil paints and we got to use them. And I think maybe that was the first time that I realized this will be my medium.
And so it just kind of clicked into place for you
Yeah.
it just felt right and you never went back.
True. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think when that happens, it can happen for a lot of folks in their career. And okay. And so then tell us about the process of making, like fixed hours, not fixed hours. What's easy? What's hard? Walk us through your process and practice, or however you think about it.
I have always had trouble with the sort of openness of being an artist, a studio artist. You certainly have deadlines. If you have a show coming up, you need to make X amount of paintings by this shipping date, and you know what to do. But I've always joked with my studio mates that I wish we had one of those punch cards when we come in and out. It takes a lot of discipline to arrive at a certain time and stay until the end of what your shift looks like. So I think everyone has their, ways they trick themselves into creating an internal schedule that works. If I had my way when I'm at residencies, I would paint until 2 a.m. I love painting in the night. I love it so much. That's my internal, I've always been this way. In university, I would study super late at night. I always hated waking up early. This is not so possible unless you don't want to have a, marriage or social life or any sort of engagement with the waking world. So I've sort of shifted earlier.
Multiple works at a time, like one thing.
I used to be incredibly monogamous with painting. So I would do one painting, then it's finished. Then I'd move to the other, then that one's finished. And I have completely abandoned that. I'm working on multiple paintings at once. I find it makes sense because with oil paint, it takes quite long to dry. So if there's an area that is wet and I need it to be dry to do like a glaze or to paint on top of it, I don't have to wait because I can just go to another painting. But I also feel there's something really valuable for me about taking some time away from a painting. Like you're not looking at it as much. Sometimes I'll turn paintings. If they're misbehaving, I'll punish them and turn them towards the wall.
Hold on. This is really important. Do the paintings have agency?
Sometimes it feels like what the painting needs is not necessarily what you envision for them. So oil paint can do this thing where, you can have a really controlled hand and understand if I do X, Y will happen, but something can just happen with the paint. Allowing those sort of moments to remain on the canvas, or most heartbreaking of all when you have to kill your darlings. You've done a really great section, some colors really worked out, and then you realize it just doesn't work for the broader painting itself, and you have to just paint over it.
Is there grieving in the loss of the original idea sometimes, the evolution of it?
I sort of like to think that a painting sometimes can contain many layers, and I don't necessarily think of it as lost. I think of it as a step to the arrival of the final painting, what that painting should be.
When the paintings are behaving badly, other than turning them around, what else do you do with them?
Other than punishing them?
Yeah, well, no, but that's only one form of punishing them. I can think of lots of ways to punish them.
True. I try to just work on, another painting, on something else. There are times when I make sister paintings, and I find that can really mitigate potential frustration. So I'll make two similar paintings if I have like an idea for a painting, and then as I'm creating this work, like, oh, well, what about if it was actually this instead, a slight difference? Instead of wiping off what I've done or painting it over, I'll just start another painting of that alternative idea, and then those will be shown as sister paintings. So then it's sort of like one single image doesn't have to carry all of the ideas.
When you are working on evolving ideas, how much do you care about how similar or different it is to other things you have done?
I've often thought that my work is quite omnivorous. So there are many different kinds of subjects that I'm interested in. I have been making a conscious effort to narrow a focus and create a cohesive body of work. So these paintings, although they might not look like exactly the same, there's some sort of thread between them, whether that is palette or maybe it's like a recurring motif or a rhyme in a sense, a poetic connection.
But as long as there's something, it could feel like it is all together in some place.
I think so, yeah. And this is also why I like having other paintings up while I'm working, because I feel like the sort of like energy in the space, you can understand one painting in its context with the other works.
That makes complete and utter sense to me. And I think that that way of the physical space hanging together also seems to show, we'll talk about this in a minute, but when the audience sees it, they're not just seeing one work of yours in isolation, they're seeing a constellation of works together. To what extent, as you're working, do you feel like, I know what I'm doing here, these are methods I've done 1,000 times before, and I'm just trying to get it right in this instance, versus developing new methods?
Yeah, I am so glad you asked this. I have been feeling quite comfortable with being able to represent what's in my head until this last painting. I'm working on a painting now, and there was a period of maybe a week and a half where every night I would come home from the studio and just say, it beat me. I give up. I have no idea.
I've had those days at work. Haven't we all had those days at work,
yes,
by the way? And if somebody here listening to this is having that day at work or at school, you're similar to what Kelsey was saying earlier about people getting stuck. You're not alone. We've all had those days, unless we're psychopaths, which some people are psychopaths, but the psychopaths have not had that day. But other than that,
I just felt completely defeated. Nothing was working. I tried all my tricks. I tried all of, the sort of things I would normally.
Sure. We all have like techniques basically.
That's it. Yeah. Everything failed. And I finally sort of broke through and was able to figure it out. Trying so many different things until the last thing that I thought to try was the thing that worked.
I love that. So, that isn't that always the way, by the way? It's like if, and so then, how do you know when you're finished?
Sometimes you have to finish because of a deadline. And other times you feel like, I like to think of it for me, like there's no part of the painting left that bothers me.
You're removing irritations. Because I know you said somewhere in public that oftentimes you start by just covering the canvas in a certain color. I don't know if that's still or
Yeah.
was something that you do.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, given that, if sometimes the work itself, like as you do it, it's telling you new things. Is the work informing what bothers you about it beyond just trying to bring some idea in your head to life?
Yeah, absolutely. There will be parts, whenever I come to the studio, I usually think about like, what is a part that I just am sick of looking at? Maybe it's because it's the underpainting, or maybe it's like not developed yet. Like, what's a part that's really sort of like, every time I look at it, it bothers me. And when all of those when it becomes this kind of like harmonious space, sometimes I'll often think like, oh, I originally was planning on doing this and this and this to it, but as it is right now, I think it works. I think it's also important to have the works sit for a bit. You can overwork a painting, you can kill it. So the alive bits of it, you can totally turn it into this like diamond, this like really hard, impenetrable thing. I like leaving some parts a little bit maybe less rendered or more open to kind of allow a bit of life to still exist in the work.
What are other difficult moments that come up as you are progressing through making a work, like the classic conundrums or obstacles that come up?
Something that can happen is if you make a study and you feel pretty happy with it, scale can change how a work is viewed. So
interesting.
You have a study and it's, 14 by 11 or 8 by 10. The composition works, the colors work, and then you're blowing it up to 6 feet or 5 feet, and something that worked at a smaller scale just does not work at a larger scale. Or if you were thinking about making a very small painting, you realize what you had as an idea for the small painting probably would have worked for a larger painting, but just doesn't work for a small painting. So scale absolutely is something that can happen.
You work in a very wide range of scales, it seems, and maybe not as I don't know if that's unusual for an artist, that you have pieces that are barely bigger than a book and pieces that seem to cover a lot of a wall.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have pieces that cover the side of a building, but maybe you do, and I'm just unaware of them. But how do you think about scale in your work and how big or small to make something?
I sometimes will think about if the work has a lot of sort of objects in it, like a dinner party scene. Sometimes I want those objects to be life-size, just so that the viewer feels like they're really there. So then, okay, if I want these objects to be life-size and I want this stuff to happen around them, the painting has to be that big, and that determined scale. What I've done before is condense sort of like larger spaces into like really tiny canvases. I feel like they become these kind of devotional objects.
Almost like a symbol of the bigger thing.
Yeah, right. And then for my larger paintings, I often feel like these are paintings where I hope that the viewer can feel like they're entering an actual space, like they're sort of part of a space.
Okay. And so is scale an easy choice or a hard one? Like, do you sometimes feel like, oh, I wish I'd done that smaller, or, something like that?
It's become much easier.
And students of yours, when they're running into these questions, like, what choices should I make? And how am I finished? How do you guide them on that?
I really firmly believe that each student has like a very separate definition of what a successful work is, which might not be the same as my definition or their classmates' definition. We start class with very predetermined sizes that I believe will be helpful for them to work with. But in terms of when a student's work is finished, I find myself often telling them more than not, don't do that next thing.
Stop. It's done. You don't realize it.
You're going to ruin it. Like you have something here that's so alive and interesting, and I know what you want to do, and you're going to kill it.
They sense that perfection may come before you realize it.
Yes.
And is there something formal you do when a piece is done, or you just set it to the side and you're like, cool, now I'm done?
I usually photograph it.
Just I love it.
I'll usually just sort of hang it up, and the next one will take its place.
I love that. What have you gotten a lot better at over the course of making works of art that feels significantly easier than it was before?
Understanding my materials, understanding all of the factors of materials, transparent versus opaque pigments, glazing versus painting alla prima, all of these endless permutations of how to apply oil paint to canvas and predicting what something will look like 5 steps in advance.
And so you now feel like a little like you know where the puck is going, pick a Canadian way of describing it.
Yeah, I think so. Like, okay, if I want this fireplace to look illuminated in this way, first I have to do this underpainting, which looks nothing like the color. And then
right.
This, and
it's sort of like a sequence of you can trust in the process more because you've seen it work.
That's it. Exactly right. Yeah.
Are there things that have gotten harder for you over time?
Yes. It's gotten harder to feel like I can make a bad painting that's just for me. I can make paintings that no one will ever see, and I can just have them in my studio and they're like secret.
That makes sense.
Like without pressure or without this idea that, well, someone's going to see this.
I wonder whether, as you've made more works of art, whether that sentiment of like, well, here, I'll describe a paradox, which is one can be both more clinical, like, oh, I know that's no big deal, without losing the emotional attachment, because that's essential for the work. So how does that all land for you in terms of attitude towards stuff that doesn't work out?
For me, attitude towards things that don't work out on the outside of the studio has certainly, I've become more blasé about, or more, taking it in stride, or that doesn't seem to be as affecting. I have not learned to, if I make a painting that I don't think is a success or it just doesn't work, it's disappointing to me.
I mean, look, I think that, by the way, complete indifference is probably also not the right response.
Sure.
You want to learn, and the disappointment is real.
Yeah.
The disappointment is real.
I have friends who their process is to make so many paintings and then they edit the bad ones out and just throw them away. So that's their way of producing work. And writers are the same. You're either a vomit writer or a diamond writer, right?
Yes, I think that's a very good way of putting it. When you know you're making something that won't be seen by others, is it different in some way?
Yeah, it feels like much more free. I had a period where I just finished a show or just shipped off a show, and my studio was totally empty, and I just got some really cheap canvases, pre-made canvases. And I did sort of paintings from imagination. Like I just had no idea, and I just started almost like an automatic painting.
Is that the painting version of free writing?
Yeah, so automatic drawing was like kind of coined by the surrealists, where it would just be sort of this like, it's like intuitive way of drawing, and you don't have an idea beforehand. You just see what comes out. So I was thinking about that while making these paintings. And, some of them I still have up around my studio in more like secluded spots, because I feel like I discovered something with them. And in a sense, even though they're not necessarily real paintings for me, I think they're predictions, like maybe in a few years or a few months, there's going to be something in those paintings that I'll use that's useful.
Yeah, I love that. So let me just ask, when we were preparing for this, you sent me something called an artist statement.
Yeah.
And I have to be honest, I didn't even know what an artist statement was. And I read it and incorporated some of the ideas in what we're talking about. What is an artist statement?
Yeah, so an artist statement, I think of it as a way for when people are looking at the work to understand it in a deeper or more contextualized way. So maybe some of the thoughts that I'm having don't necessarily, I think they're very clear in the paintings, and someone who looks at them would have no idea that those are embedded. I think that's fine. I think that's the interesting thing about making work. I wouldn't want my paintings to only have one interpretation. And I love when I have people come in my studio, or if I, talk to them at an exhibition, I love how people will pick up on things that I just completely had never thought of consciously. For me, it's a different kind of language that's saying the same thing. So we work in a visual language that other people don't also necessarily express themselves in. But with an artist statement, it's writing. Everyone writes, everyone reads. I think it's an access point for those who maybe aren't familiar with the medium, the visual medium that you're working in.
What I hear it as is it's almost part of the work, in the sense that it is, in the way that when back in the day bands used to make liner notes for their music,
right.
Like music had to stand on its own, but the explanation became part of the work too, in whatever direct and indirect ways. When you're sketching in your notebook, writing ideas, do those make it into the artist statement?
Yeah, I think so. Something that surprised me in the past few years has been the conversations I'll have in my studio with peers, how those will make its way into the artist statement. So things that people have brought up in my work that I maybe necessarily wouldn't have thought of, I'll think about them more, and those will end up becoming woven into the artist statement.
Is there an artist statement for each work or for the artist?
It's usually for like a body of work, or it's for the artist.
For a showing of several works.
And you'll end up revising your artist statement sometimes once a year or every 6 months,
as you evolve.
Yes, exactly. But it's meant to generally provide a scaffolding into the inner workings of this person's practice.
How does it relate to titling works? Like we talked about finishing a work and taking a picture, but we didn't talk about naming the work.
Yes. Sometimes the title happens before the painting, and the title will drive the painting.
Fascinating.
Oftentimes the title will come after. So when I have reference photos and I save them on my computer in a folder, I'll title them like a very descriptive, seeing those file names so often, that will maybe influence me a little bit when I end up coming up with the title. Often I'll be reading and a line or a few words from the book I'm reading will stand out. That will end up becoming a title. And oftentimes I'll make very just descriptive titles.
Does the title play a role in selling the work? Actually, let's start with that.
I think a title can play a role in the viewer's connection to the work. So a title can be a powerful way to sort of indicate what the work is about, and that can help someone connect if they wouldn't have reason to know about this. What someone sees for the first time is the image, is the painting. So I think that's sort of the first impression.
What roles does selling the work play in your life as an artist? And I guess what I mean by that is obviously people need money. So selling the work gives money, but it's also how the work gets exposed to audiences often. And so what roles does the process of showing and selling work play? Yeah, just tell us what it does, what its function is.
I think of it as once a painting is finished and leaves my studio, I don't miss them that much. I have a few paintings I wish I still had those in my studio. I'd love to be able to look at them, refer to them. But I don't feel incredibly sentimental about I wish this painting was back in my studio, because I just think of it as opening up new space for new paintings. And that's sort of how I think about when I sell the work. That is supporting the next body of work. So it's the work.
It finances your continued work as an artist.
Yeah, I like to think of each body of work potentially facilitates the next.
If you won the lottery, would you sell your work?
I would, because I want people to have it if they want it, if it resonates with them. Sometimes collectors will send images of the work when it's installed in their home, or they'll say like, oh, I never realized how the colors change so much in the morning when I go to work, and then when I come home, it looks like a different painting. Like that is everything. That another person somehow feels a connection to something that I've made. That's everything.
How do you sell work? What are the different ways?
There are so many different ways. Artists sell work from their studios directly. Artists, when they are working with galleries, the gallery will, on their behalf, handle the sales of the work. People sell work on Instagram. So many different ways.
Okay, let me ask it differently. How do you sell your work?
I'm working with galleries. I'll give the work to the gallery will show the work, and the collectors will go through the gallery.
Okay, so I'm going to rewind a little bit. You've got your work you've done in your studio.
Yes.
Call up the gallery and be like, hey, I'm an artist. Check out my work. Or how does that happen that a gallery decides to, I imagine it's quite competitive for certain galleries.
Sure, yes, of course.
And so how does one establish the kind of working relationship where one even has the license to show the work?
It usually will start with some kind of introduction. So you meet a gallerist, or you are introduced to them by someone. Then they'll come for a studio visit. Maybe they'll come for many studio visits. Maybe I've had experiences where after a studio visit, the gallery said, okay, we would love to have a solo show with you next year. Other times it can be months or years pass, and then maybe this gallery invites you to be in a group show. But if you have established a relationship with them, you'll usually have like maybe work in a group show, or you'll have a solo show with them, and then the work will be exhibited there.
Do you tend to want to work with all the same galleries, or do you want to find variety? How does that balance work?
Yeah,
you decide what galleries you want to chase after, because the introductions may happen from out of the blue, but my guess is there's some cases where you've requested to get to know a gallery.
Right. I think finding a gallery where there's a lot of trust and support is so important.
Right. We've talked about cases where that has broken down for you. And
sure, of course. My gallery in Stockholm, I feel incredibly supported by them. It's been a great years-long relationship. So what will happen is we'll decide to have a show based on their programming calendar. They'll tell me what month, or ask what month works. And then from that time in between, you're sort of working on work for this show. And you know that everything you're working on is going here. You know the size of the space, how many paintings approximately you're going to make. But then sometimes you'll get an email out of the blue. Oh, we're having a group show. We'd like to invite you to participate. Sometimes you don't have any works available. Sometimes you have to scramble to make a work. Sometimes you have works that are perfect for the show. So it's a little bit different in that case.
When I think about art as a human, I think about it being shown in places where you don't buy the art. That's kind of like a wonderful and prestigious place to have your art be shown.
Yes.
How does that work? Is every place it's shown also selling? Clearly not a museum. But what's the relationship between how an audience discovers you in places that are not selling the art versus the cases where you do want to sell it?
I think for better or worse, Instagram has been, for visual artists, a pretty reliable place to discover new artists, make new connections. Unless you're inviting a lot of people regularly to your studio, which can be a little bit exhausting, I think that's ended up being like a really valuable tool, as harmful also as it is.
What are the harms?
I feel personally for myself, as one tends to do, when you share something on Instagram, it's like an accomplishment. It's something that's good that's happened. So it's this endless feed of like every artist doing
the same as everybody else
and doing all these great things.
Okay, so you show a bunch of works. Who decides what the price is? How often do they sell? Is there negotiation? I always have this sense with art that because it doesn't feel like commerce, the more it is fine art, the more the artist and the collector are held at a distance from each other
Yes.
in the transaction part.
Yeah.
And so just tell us about some of how that mechanically works.
So when I was younger, I am not working with galleries. I would price my work based on how good of a painting I thought it was, like how long it took me even.
Oh, right. Effort, based on effort.
But as I started working with galleries, it ends up being a formula, which feels so incredibly liberating as an artist. And the formula that I've been using, and I know that some of the galleries I work with use, is height in inches plus width in inches times a factor. And that factor changes and increases.
Meaning that it's literally about size?
Yes.
So shouldn't everybody then paint larger paintings? I mean, I'm not saying that they should be just chasing the money, but I'm just curious.
Well, I think that works when you have a range of paintings in your practice. There are some people who only make small paintings, and then therefore their prices would be adjusted.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, so it's relative to your own paintings as opposed to like big artists who paint big always sell for more than artists who paint for small.
Yeah, that's not necessarily the case.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, sorry, I misunderstood.
But
okay, so they've got some and the factor, I mean, isn't that sort of that formula you described by definition true if the factor varies for each painting?
Yes. Well, the factor usually varies for where the artist is in their career. Like if this is your first solo show, that factor is smaller. And then as you have more shows or you have
a track record of selling well or something like that,
factor would increase. But it's taken a lot of the sort of like emotional turmoil out of how do I price this work, or this work, I don't really like it, so how could it be as much as this one? But
do you find that what collectors want from your works is different than what you are proud of? Like some of the pieces that are your very favorites struggle, and some of the ones
sometimes
like, I thought that one, I just farted that one out, and then there's people lining up around the door kind of thing.
Yeah, sometimes it totally aligns. Like, oh, I know this piece is so great, and the market agrees. And sometimes, this piece, it kind of surprised me a bit, and I'm not, I'm unsure about it, and someone connects with it immediately. Or a piece that I feel like is really, really interesting and great doesn't necessarily.
How much conflict is there over what the right prices are?
If you have a gallery that you trust, they know their client base, they know what works, they can, what they can sell, they can advise you.
How many works do you typically show at a time, and how many of them sell or need to sell? How do you think about how successful the show has to be at selling? Or is it more like, no, if you sell one work in a show, everybody's thrilled?
I think that depends on like the shifts of the market.
Bitcoin prices are going up. All the art collectors are flush with cash kind of thing.
Yeah. Or there'll be times when, you're talking to your friends and like everyone's they're having these great shows and maybe they're getting good press, but like the show doesn't sell as well. And then other times it will sell on the very first like opening day. It's incredibly difficult to predict.
Do you think about who the people are who are the collectors at all and what they want? And maybe not as individuals, but as a group, do you have an image of them in your head?
Well, I think there are many kinds of collectors. Some collectors think of artwork as an investment. So they're interested in artists that they believe might become really large, and they'll be able to resell those works eventually and make a profit.
They're like business actors on some level themselves. They also love the art, but Yeah.
And then there are collectors that love art, but aren't really sure what to look for. And so they work with art consultants or art advisors.
Oh, yeah.
And then there are collectors that they see a work and they love it and they connect with it and they want to live with it. And they choose a work based on that.
For you,
Hmm.
at this stage of your career, how do you relate to how well your art sells?
In what way?
Some people say, like, yeah, I just can't make enough of it. It just keeps flying off the shelf. Some people say, yeah, that's a real slog to try to figure out. It's like, no, it's in a place where it gives me what I need it to give me, and I continue working on it. And, just curious, how large does that loom? Here, I'll put another way of putting it. If you have 100% attention to give to your work,
Right.
and X% of it goes to making the art, how much of your attention goes to selling the art?
I mean, it happens kind of after the fact, like when the work is already out of the studio. And then it really does feel out of your hands. I mean, of course, you can, build connections with collectors and try to find ways to introduce your work to collectors. But once the work leaves the studio, I think of it as like, it's out of my hands, it's out of my control. I had a conversation with a sculptor friend quite recently I think it can be very natural for artists to think of the market show by show. So, this show completely sold out on the very first day, and this one didn't do so well, so that I'm in a bad place now. And then this one did really well, so I'm in a good place. And I was trying to think of it, something that's been helpful is instead of thinking show by show, maybe thinking of in like a 5-year span, generally, how
It's sort of an era versus a moment.
Yes, exactly. Because a lot of the factors are the market, which you can't control. And it's really not about the quality of your work.
Letting it go a little bit on seeing the result. I mean, sort of being attached to the inputs, not the outputs, if you will.
Yeah.
The other lines of work.
Almost sort of zooming out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I forgot to ask about is, people seem to go to all these art festivals, Art Basel, blah, blah, blah. Art fairs, thank you.
Yeah.
Not festivals. See, what role do the art fairs play in the sharing of doing the work, the selling of the work?
Yeah. So I've exhibited in art fairs at NADA most recently in Miami. Art fairs, I guess, are an opportunity for many, like people who aren't necessarily local in your city, to see work from many different places.
So it's sort of for the patron, collector, what's the right word?
Collector.
Art appreciator,
Yeah.
the collector, they can, it's a one-stop shop for them.
Yes, it does often feel like that. It's like stalls crammed with artwork, and
that makes sense. And okay, can we move to talking then about how you communicate more broadly about yourself and your work?
Yeah, sure.
So you strike me as a person who is not like a self-promoter type. My guess is that there is a wide range of levels of comfort and skill in the art world with people who communicate about themselves.
Yeah.
And so how do you think about what the role of the artist is and your own in getting the word out? And at some point, I guess, if the art is going to have an audience, somebody's going to have to hear about it.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, beyond putting it in galleries and selling it, if there are other ways that you think about that.
I've found the best conversations I've had are the organic ones at openings, when you run into people, maybe at parties. If you show up to your friends' openings, if you go to openings and really show up for the people around you, I think those...
When there's an opening, how many of the people there are collectors versus other artists supporting each other?
I feel like there's often a lot of artists.
Awesome.
Yeah, networking makes my skin crawl a little bit. I could always be better at it. I wish I were naturally better at it. I've really prioritized like actual conversations and connections with people around me. It just feels like I don't know if I could operate in a different way. But some people are so great at it, and I wish I had more of that, and I'm sure that's something I could learn. But it's just not my natural way of being.
Does geography play a role? I mean, you're based in Brooklyn. You can go to openings in a
Right.
major city. That's an expensive place to live that allows you to do that. My guess is most of the places where art is frequently seen are relatively expensive places to live. So how much does geography matter?
Oh, I think it matters quite a bit less. Well, it matters less now with something like Instagram. But when
Mm,
I was living in Winnipeg, where I grew up, I mean, you only really, you could, like, there were art magazines that you could order and see like what was going on in New York and LA, but you really weren't exposed to a lot of art. Um,
right,
and
sure.
then moving to somewhere like Montreal or to New York, where it's like you can see art every day and you can, actually meet the artists and they become your friends. And it really, the potential for community and peers here feels really, really important.
Then the strategies might differ a little bit depending on whether or not you're based in, in Brooklyn, Berlin, or Winnipeg, is I think what I hear you saying.
I think so. I think so.
And other intermediaries, like in many other domains, there's somebody who is the explainer. They write the newsletter, and that's what people really want to get into. In your case, you're married to somebody who's a critic in another domain in film, but still, are there intermediaries?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are people who write about art. There are people who sort of introduce art to broader audiences, or there are people who will visit artist studios and then post about that on Instagram, and that will be a way for people to discover new work as well.
Are there some that you as an artist look to and you're like, well, this really is important, this person's opinion matters a lot? Or we make it less personal for your students. If your students are seeking something that tries to get their work exposed to people, are there intermediaries they tend to go to, art influencers, I don't know, like you said, people who write about it? Or is it more like, no, we'll just get the stuff out and it happens somewhat organic? Are there art PR agents? Like, I don't even know, there must be.
There might very well be. It's certainly not like having an agent in like the literary world. Like,
Meaning there's nobody who is responsible for advancing you in that way.
I think the gallery would be the closest. If you work closely with a gallery, if you're represented by a gallery, I think it's in their interest to promote you and support you and hopefully help you level up as an artist. But I think in many ways, there are people that, like critics, that are invested in discovering and sharing other artists' work.
It sounds like in a healthy way, there's so many worlds that are so mediated now.
Yeah.
Where, oh, you want your podcast to break out, you gotta get blah, blah, blah. I mean,
Yeah, right.
says a person with a podcast. And it's refreshing to hear that it may be a little bit less like that, that sort of your attention, actually of all the worlds that I think I've spoken to and engaged with over time, what you're describing sounds much less, where the focus can be much more on the work than in many other domains. I mean, I hear lots of, for example, if I'm a very senior lawyer, senior lawyers I talk to say, I spend all my time selling. And very little time of my lawyering. I'm exaggerating a little bit, not, hey, lawyer friends, no, you're not the one who said that to me, but it sounds much more like that. And in a way, it sounds ideal. And we'll talk a little bit more about the art world, but is there any other attention that you give in any way, or that you advise your students to give on, do you need to make your website? Is there like other things you do to get word out about yourself? You've got to have a profile on artin.com. I don't know, making shit up.
Having a website, I think, is very crucial, just as a way for people who don't necessarily know your work. I mean, Instagram can also operate in that way, like you have an archive of your work. I feel like there are just so many different approaches, and I think some artists are super, super heavy on the promotion, and it fits them, and that feels natural and good for them. I tend to sort of show up for my artist peers, the people I met at Columbia, make sure I'm at their shows.
Friends.
That feels sustainable for me.
Okay. So can we talk now about career management?
Yes.
What does the arc of an artist's career look like? I mean, obviously there's going to be a lot of variation, but it's not like you put stuff into your 401k. I mean, maybe it is when you have a professor job. That's more like a traditional job. But just sketch out for us how you think about the arc of an artist's career.
Okay, this is going to be a generalization, but also inherently personal, because for as many artists as there are in the world, their arcs look.
You know one artist's career kind of thing?
Yeah, that's just so impossible. Someone can be painting alone and undiscovered, and then when they're 60, they're in museums. And
does that actually happen?
It does. Yeah. And people could die and then be discovered, after. And then there are people that, do everything right. They do all of the right steps, and maybe it doesn't go as they expect. But for me, if I had to generalize, I would say the first step would be to find yourself in a place where you can be surrounded by and taught by people who will help you and pay attention to your work. So whether that is in an institution like a university or through alternative modes of education, that feels to me crucial.
I mean, it's interesting because you described yourself showing up for those who you want to support as a community supporter and builder, and you're now describing the early stage being a community almost like receiver or beneficiary.
Yeah, yes.
Participant is maybe a better way of putting it.
I think what's helpful there is a lot of times those spaces help contextualize your ideas in like the larger art conversation. So if you're only just painting and you're not really looking at anything else and you don't have other ideas coming in, you can sort of think that like what you're doing is very singular, when in fact there are other people, maybe contemporarily or maybe hundreds of years ago or 50 years ago, who are also kind of doing the same thing.
By the way, this happens, I mean, look, we do call it prior art. This happens in my line of work as well, where someone's like, I've got this amazing idea. And you're like, dude, I got 9 clones of that already exist.
Yes.
And, and the interesting thing is, I'm curious if this parallel lands at all. In the world of startups, the very best people become more determined by that because they're like, no, those are really similar. They sound the same, but I've got my way of doing it that is my own. And many of the works, I'm not, as you know, a great understander of the visual arts, but many of the works that I've loved in other domains are just like other things in some sense, only better. It's like, it's another post-apocalyptic fiction novel, but it's Station 11, it's another musical, but it's Hamilton. And like in a certain sense, formulaically, In the Heights and Hamilton are very similar. In the Heights is a good musical, but it's no Hamilton. And so, I'm curious how much that similarity in prior art affects somebody in their career. Is it deflating? How it helps people relate,
I've always found it very interesting if I've stumbled across another artist who I didn't know about before. I really haven't seen their work before. And I feel like our work is similar, or is dealing with similar things. I think to me, it's more of like a collective consciousness. Like, of course, there are many people thinking of similar things in the world and making those things, and those things are shared. Like the same ideas are happening.
The way in which then somebody finds their place. So they found their community, and then I interrupted you as sort of getting sidetracked. So talk to me a little bit about how they find their place after that.
Right. So then I think it's a question of how can you carve out your art practice? You have to live and pay rent and buy groceries, and you have to find a place to work, whether that's in your apartment or whether you rent a studio or you share a studio space. You have to kind of like figure out a way, like how can what part of my week or my days can I devote to like making this thing? And can I do it in a way that feels sustainable to me? And then I think the next step would be going on residencies or applying for smaller opportunities, doing group shows in galleries, just Something that reflects back to you that you're an artist and this is your identity. I kind of think that's important, or that's what I found very important. It's almost like a way to fortify yourself. Like, when you go to a residency and you're meeting all these brand new people from all over, and they think of you as, oh, that's the sculptor, that's the painter, that's the writer. This is like your core identity. And the other parts of your identity kind of fall away in this very specialized space. No one knows your partner, if you have kids, or where you necessarily live, or where you went to school. It's like you're being introduced in this very singular way. And I think that's really fortifying sometimes.
What are some of the other chapters that unfold over time for a person? It's like you're a student and there's studios. And so does that not start early on? What is that?
So I would say this is often like after you would graduate. If you have artists that you admire their work, or maybe you've met them somewhere, a studio visit is you go to their studio and talk about their work and hear what they have to say about it.
You've begun to build those gallery relationships. Is there a steady state? Like, do you feel like you're in the steady state?
I feel like that is something that can never be a steady state. Recently, quite a lot of galleries in New York have closed. If you are working with a gallery or you're represented by them and all is going well, that can, just like anything else, that can change. I think perhaps later, if you're incredibly lucky and you are working with like a really well-known gallery and your work is pretty much solidified in the sense of like you are a figure in contemporary art, that feels like it could be more steady. I'm certainly not there, so I wouldn't know. Maybe.
No, but I think that's part of the reason we're talking now, is that I'm curious about what feels alive and present in the very stage that you're at. And some of that is anticipating what stages might come.
Yes. And I think another part of it is that you're always kind of unaware of what opportunities might crop up and relationships, and you might open your email and it is great news or not great news. I feel like where I'm at, I want to continue to be excited and surprised by my own work. I want there to be moments in the studio where I can't really predict what happens with the paintings, because I want to feel a drive to keep coming back to the studio. And I think if you get to a point where you're making like one kind of painting and that painting sells and it's very reliable, does it just feel like a factory after a while? Like, how do you motivate yourself to continue to grow as an artist and sustain a painting career for the next 50 years?
And okay, and those are the things we all anticipate, I guess. And my guess is some artists evolve into periods of doing more and less work or do teaching and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Totally get that. I can imagine the sort of mode shifting feels like it would be potentially really nourishing.
Yes.
How about, can I ask about some indelicate stuff?
Yeah.
The financial side of managing your life as an artist. It's a lot harder than the financial side of managing your life as a lawyer.
Yes, it is. Yes.
How do you think about it? Like there's a view that like art is only for people who grew up with lots of money. And obviously that's not the case. Many, many artists for whom that is the opposite of the case. And many people feel compelled toward art as a career in the way that people do not feel compelled toward, let's say, accountancy in quite the same way. Yeah. And so how do you handle the practical aspect of just making the financial side of your life work?
It's really, really hard. And I think it continues to be hard as your paintings sell for more money. You have other responsibilities. It's not something that's salaried. It's hard to predict sometimes what will do well, what years you'll do well, what years you won't. But it's a sacrifice that you choose. You really have to choose it every day. And there are people working in finance who make sacrifices maybe with their quality of work-life balance.
Sure.
And many other things. So it's definitely a difficult sacrifice.
And are there practical sides of it of like, oh yeah, the great artists always end up learning how to create a side hustle in the beginning, or it turns out they're artists who are actually surprisingly great investors with their own money. I don't know, I'm just making that up.
Yeah, maybe there are. I think teaching for me has been like more of sort of the stable part of that. You do get a paycheck and you can rely on it, and it's every 2 weeks. You also, I think as an artist, you're sort of like always reevaluating what is necessary financially. It's a very kind of like different dinner party if you're with a bunch of artists than if you're with a bunch of people in finance.
That makes total sense, of course. And how about the inner life of being an artist? Let's talk about that. It's like it's one of these, again, and all work is emotional and can be challenging. But I'm curious how you think about what is, in your own inner work or in the inner work of others. It feels like art brings a particular kind of set of questions, maybe challenges, but at least questions.
I found it to be incredibly fulfilling, meaningful. It is the most meaningful thing I can think of doing with my life. When someone else sees your work and really connects with it, you feel like they're seeing you in a sense. That can be really challenging if you work in marketing and you propose something and your boss hates it, and you can always come home and say, oh, my boss is an idiot, and I don't identify.
But in art, you can't detach yourself from the work in quite the same way. It's more fused.
It is.
You're literally self-expressing.
It is like truly a part of you, and if it's not well received, it's hard to compartmentalize that.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And so what kinds of techniques do people have? Are there certain forms of like, I know like methods like the artist's way, but are there classic books, or, is there a therapist who's the secret therapist to a lot of artists because actually the issues are different?
Yeah. I mean, I think probably every artist who has a therapist has talked about this feeling with them ad nauseum.
I can only imagine.
I found the strategy to be most helpful is talking to your friends about it. Sometimes in the art world, what can happen is people can be a bit cagey because no one really wants to admit like, oh no, my show went horribly and I'm super disappointed. But I think when you have a group of friends that you can trust and really talk about those times, you realize that they've gone through the same thing or they are going through the same thing. And an insight that has been incredibly helpful is at every stage, you admire the next stage. Like, oh, well, this artist has it all. They have exactly what I wish I had. And then you talk to them and they're like
suffering with something too, of course, like any human being.
Yes.
There's no rung on the ladder that feels like, okay, I made it.
Right.
I mean, or put differently, actually, I think the better way to put it is every rung on the ladder can feel like I've made it.
Yes. Yeah.
Because my guess is there are a lot of aspiring artists who look at you and think, oh my gosh, professor in 2 places, had all these fellowships, like been, chosen for these galleries, like in art fairs and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And, their story of what your life must feel like is probably different than your experience of what your life feels like.
Yeah. I was having a picnic with one of my friends, and we decided to do this thing where we would each like tell our younger self, 10 years younger self, just describe our life, describe it.
Oh, I love that. What a good exercise.
We both knew, we've been friends for over 10 years. So we both knew each other back 10 years ago. And so it's almost like we did this thing where we each sort of like described what our lives were like and tried to imagine if our younger selves heard that, like, what would you think? So I try to think of it like that too. In those periods where, oh, nothing is going right and it's really hard, I would be very happy hearing this, even the bad parts 10 years ago. And hopefully in 10 years, I'll be able to tell my present age self new things.
If your 10 years from now self went back and asked you, what are you trying to get better at now? in your occupation as an artist? What are you working on? Like, what does the direction look like?
I think sometimes people are like hunters or fawns.
What does that mean?
Like some people naturally are like pursuers, and some people like to, are there more like they would prefer to be pursued, like even in relationship dynamics, interpersonal dynamics. I think I would like to try to be more of a hunter and sort of
You would like to be proactively seeking out the things you want as opposed to making things and hoping to get supported or noticed in some way.
Right, or to even be like maybe more direct with people and not be so Canadian and sort of
Well, I mean, look, that is a Canadian dilemma that I've seen in all occupations and walks of life. Is Canadians want to be more direct and often feel like they are not. And
right.
And if you're a hunter, are you marketing yourself more?
I think that would probably be part of it. Although I really want to maintain a kind of like integrity and not feel like I'm just making advertisements. But I do think there's room for me to be more proactive in that way, to be more of a hunter.
Now, just in terms of understanding, again, the arc of the career.
Yeah.
You described trying to move toward being more of a hunter. I just want to ask, are there goals for yourself that you feel like are the next phase? Is it just that, hey, I'm a name and I can snap my fingers and have a wider range of things? Is it like, here's how I'm trying to ask it. And then we can move on to talking about the broader art world. The way I'm trying to ask it is, do you feel like there's some step change, or is it ahead of you, like a big leap? Or is it more like, no, I'll just keep broadening and expanding and growing, and that's the work?
I had like a spreadsheet of goals, and it feels good to cross those out as they happen. Something that feels like a goal would be working with a gallery in New York. My gallery is in Stockholm, so I think because I live in New York.
You say my gallery, does that mean that an artist tends to have an exclusive relationship with a single gallery over a period of time?
The representation is kind of like you are with that
person.
So I've worked with galleries in New York, but I don't have an exclusive relationship with one yet. And I think that feels like a natural next step because I live here. Then it would be a chance for my paintings to be shown more regular in a way like amongst the community that
you're part of.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else we should know about managing your career when art students ask you for your best piece of advice or something like that before we broaden to talking about the art world?
Just very briefly, like I think to find people who can be in a mentorship position. There are so many questions that one can have, and I hope I can be that for my students. I didn't really have that. So I think that's really important.
A lot of guesswork, basically.
Yeah.
In the absence of that, there's this line that my wife often says about how we should have mentors in each decade of their lives. So somebody in their 20s, somebody in their 30s, somebody in their 40s.
Yeah, that's great.
Learn different things from different people. Like,
yes, absolutely.
I'm not going to ask how to handle some detail of fabrication from somebody who doesn't make, doesn't stretch canvases or something.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that there's something, to the close mentors are like, oh, the person's a couple of years ahead of me. They figured some things out I haven't, versus the distant mentors who maybe be more zoomed out. And so it sounds like a similar dynamic. Okay, can we talk about the art world?
Yes.
The way the art world is set up, artists having, let's say, like reputations or brands, Instagram and all that, how works get sold through this constellation of fairs and galleries, and also, the direct stuff. I'm kind of not talking about people like doing the kind of art that you're doing. Does that system help or hurt in the making of good art? Like, is it set up to achieve the goal?
Oh, I don't know.
Do you feel like there are ways the system makes it harder to make good art, for example?
I think that there can be a feeling like only a few artists really succeed.
Like it's a superstar culture the way it is in so many other occupations.
Yes. And if you're not making this kind of work, and if you're not succeeding in this way, then you as an artist are failing. And then you get discouraged. Artists.
Meaning there's an establishment path. The establishment path is driven by stars, or at least by a subset of people who are
right.
small, and that you feel like it's not good art or it's not a success unless you are one of those stars or possibly could become one of those stars.
Well, I think that's the danger that system sets up. And I think it's really unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate that there aren't more sort of publicly funded programs for artists. Art in many places, including here sometimes, I think is seen as like frivolous. It's not necessary. Humans have always made art and will, in the most prosperous eras, art is something that is attached to those eras.
Yeah, it's interesting how like there's this historical association that jumps in. In this historical era, what role do you feel like art is playing?
Something really positive about social media is that people who would have normally been like outside of this very small and rarefied space can now feel connected to a broader community. And I think also that opens up a lot of visibility for art that's not necessarily handpicked by these like few galleries or few art magazines. And what could maybe feel like this impenetrable ceiling before now feels like it's spread out and more accessible.
And, maybe that touches on, like there used to be a system back in the day where like, artists might be under contract and work in a loft with a bunch of other artists they were working with. It's like The Factory, felt a little bit like that model. And now it's a little more porous and freewheeling, or maybe it was always porous around the edges. We just didn't see it.
Yeah.
Bring more diverse perspectives in. I mean, you've talked about the role of gender in your work. Obviously, both of us, it's a little harder for us to have personal experience much on race as part of this. But what are the forms of when we talk about broadening, how do we realize the benefit of that as a society in terms of the voices that we hear? And how does diversity of perspective, how well does that function in the art world today?
I mean, I think it's just recognizing that like, oh, my story is here as well. Like I can connect to this. I connect to that. I can.
It's not just the problems that are faced by the kind of people who could have afforded an MFA in the past.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And does the art world do well on this? Like, is it a feeling of like, oh yeah, there's a wide range of voices, or what needs to be better in that? Which voices are missing? I'll also, maybe some of it is nationality too, like immigration and geography. In science, used to be much more free flow of talent back and forth, let's say to the US. Now it's much more constrained. And so I'm just curious how well that's working.
I think there's always room to do better. I mean, there have been efforts like during the Me Too movement. We saw like many more women's voices, like especially women who were making art and were not at all acknowledged. During BLM, I think there's been voices amplified for the art world that maybe haven't necessarily been before. But I think I would like to see at an institutional level, like the people making decisions about what artwork is shown. Like I think diversity there could always be improved.
You're talking about like people in the big museums or galleries or whatever it is.
Yeah.
What? Okay, so I'll ask one last question. Well, maybe one or two last questions.
Yeah.
What's changing now in the art world?
I think as time progresses, there will be a greater blur between what is fine art and what is design and what is advertisement and what is AI. I think the lines are blurring much more now.
And technology in particular feels like that will be a profound impact for a while?
I think it has been. and
maybe since the beginning of art, technology on pigments and stuff like that.
Sure, yes, of course.
But-
It always influences.
But now maybe more so or faster or something like that.
Yeah, and I can't predict what it will be, but I think about like French Impressionism. The reason why this came about is because that's when paints were, manufactured in tubes, so people could go out into the world and work instead of just.
Yeah. And before that, they had to mix in their studio, basically.
Yeah, like a whole, big movements rely on technology.
If you had to guess on how technology is changing things right now, what would your guess be?
I think it'll be something similar to photography. And at the beginning of photography, I think the fine art photography really felt rarefied. Not everyone has a lab or equipment, and photos, like cameras on phones, are so great, and people are shooting movies on their iPhone, and you no longer need like a big investment in equipment to make good photography. And now I think with AI and digital means, people will be able to generate images in a way that, like, just with like a written prompt.
This is just a final words kind of question about if somebody, is considering stepping in to this world and trying their hand at it, a prospective student, not yet a student, what would you say to them?
I think you know what you want to do. And there
if you don't know, that's a sign, basically.
There are so many reasons why you shouldn't become an artist.
Right. I mean, this is the same in some ways as being an entrepreneur. It's like the defaults are all stacked against you. So if you want to do it, you got to know.
But if you find yourself in your idle hours thinking about making art, you should do it, because you're going to be thinking about that. Like when I was in
might as well
undergrad writing my thesis and in the lab, I was thinking about art, and it felt like a chore to do any other thing. And now, with all of the difficulties and the financial instability and the personal disappointment, there's this feeling that like what I'm doing is the thing that I naturally would think about. And that kind of cohesion feels incredibly meaningful.
I love that.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. I mean, what a tour de force. Thanks for listening to This Is Not Advice. And if you want to see Kelsey's art for yourself, you can go to kelseyshwetz.com. And remember, This Is Not Advice started as a series of hundreds of short answers to people's dilemmas about work, though we never really talked about what it might look like to work in a painting studio. If you're interested in more, you can head on over to the website, thisisnotadvice.work, which is a guide based on all those questions and answers, which you or anyone can edit. And if you made it this far, I'd also love to hear what you think of this experiment of doing This Is Not Advice in long form about a whole occupation, especially one that is removed from the day-to-day for many of us in tech, startups, and office work. Would love to hear, because as my coach tells me, your feedback is a gift. I'm Roy Bahat, and thank you for listening.